Welcome to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters, a bi-monthly forum of various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of websites. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, a senior fellow at the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by Mikko Tolonen, who has written the lead essay for our October 2020 forum on Bernard Mandeville. If you'd like to watch any of the other interviews by the authors of our response essays for this forum, or any of the other interviews in this series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself on the Online Library of Liberty is also on our YouTube channel. Mikko Tolonen is an associate professor in digital humanities at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Helsinki. He's the principal investigator of Helsinki Computational History Group at Helsinki Centre for Digital Humanities. Since 2015, he has been organizing the Helsinki Digital Humanities Seminar, and from 2015 to 2017, he was professor of research on digital resources and worked with the National Library of Finland. Tolonen has played a relevant role building digital humanities infrastructure at the Faculty of the Arts at the University of Helsinki since 2015. He also works in other areas of Enlightenment studies, such as the intellectual development of Bernard Mandeville and David Hume. In 2016, he was awarded an Open Science and Research Award by the Finnish Ministry of Education. He is the author of Mandeville and Hume, Anatomists of Civil Society, published in 2013, as well as various other articles on 18th century political and intellectual thinkers. Mikko, it's a great pleasure to have you at the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks very much for having me. It's an honor, really.
Well, it was. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It was a great forum. It's we've had a very stimulating collection of essays, and yours started us off with some really interesting thoughts comparing Mandeville and Hayek. And I think a lot of people, maybe not a lot of people knew, but that Mandeville made a big impact on Hayek's thought. Can you tell us a little bit? I mean, I know that people might be familiar with the fable of the bees, and they are familiar with the general conceptions and the sort of stereotypes about Mandeville. But can you provide our viewers with a little bit of historical background on Mandeville, the person, and the kind of provocative role he played in the political intellectual political period of his life?
Sure. So Mandeville, he's Dutch. That's important. So he's immigrant when he comes to London, where he makes an impact. So he moved from Rotterdam to London, sort of a late 16 or early 1690s, and he made his career actually first as a doctor. So he was a medical doctor who wrote especially on hypochondria and that sort of stuff, and he saw himself as a kind of like a state physician. So a type of anatomist of civil society perspective is very much embedded there in Mandeville by him thinking about civil society. He was also, he was a very, very versatile thinker, a very broad intellectual. So English was maybe his fourth or fifth language, but all of his works, or there are some Latin and some Dutch things, but most of the body of his works are in English. And he also wrote poetry. So he started off, he's kind of like a social thinker, started as a poem called Grumbling Hive, where he claimed that sort of in a way that what he did in his famous fable of the bees, the private vices lead to public benefits. And if you want to make a large society honest and very virtuous, what happens is that the baby goes out with the bathwater, so that you may become virtuous, but the prosperity is lost. So you need to be able to cope with vice, and you need to be that's where the political system starts to play a crucial role. So you have to stream the vices to the right direction in order to get to the flourishing society. But he was very much looking at questions from a very analytical perspective. And then a lot of people mistook him as a kind of like the man devil, in a way that he would be. He caused when there was one edition of the Fable of the Beast published in 1720s, it caused almost the riots on the streets. It was burned by people. The book itself, it was said that this is a cause of a lot of bad things. There was a lot of a sort of a Republican virtuous type of thinkers, such as Francis Hutcheson, who always were preaching against Mandeville. And part of it, why it caused such a riot or uproar against Mandeville, was that he went head to head against these Reformation societies that were wanted to really get rid of vice. So it wasn't only Mandeville. It wasn't only an intellectual endeavor that he was participating in, but it was direct political action as well, and that then caused a lot of disputes in the 18th century. But at the same time, I mean, what's with Mandeville is that he was looking at maybe the political questions from a very different type of perspective than many of the people at the time. So he was really almost a sociological thinker. When he's writing against these, what he took as a hypocrites, talking about making the 18th century London virtuous, when he was exposing the hypocrisy, he wasn't necessarily saying that it is good to have vice, but it's the point that he's making is that there are certain realities that we need to live with, and human nature, especially if we look at human nature, there are certain ways that we behave as humans, and what is important is that we channel that and in the right way, so that it produces something that is good, instead of trying to change human nature. That basically is what he's trying to do.
So this is an excellent jumping off point. I'm really glad you started with this discussion of politics, but also his view. I think it's frequently characterized as normative, but in your well, certainly in your work, and I think when you read Mandeville, it's not clear that he's making normative claims. He's making claims that are, as you said, analytical. And one of the ones I wanted to start off with that's in your essay is your discussion of self-esteem. It struck me that one of the really important aspects of his work is not merely looking at how individuals would react materially, but that there is a self-esteem component with the working poor, and how that helps bind society together. Can you elaborate on that part of your essay a little bit and talk a little bit about what self-esteem was for Mandeville, what it was in the context of the period in the early 18th century that he was writing in, and how it interacts with the other factors that he thinks are necessary to keep societies bound together?
Of course. So, I mean, one thing about Mandeville, how he's been kind of, I don't know, misread or presented earlier, is that people have taken him to be this kind of a hobbyist egoist, in a way that self-love is the way to explain everything, and everything is about self-preservation, really, for Mandeville. Like some people say that it was for not necessarily Hobbes himself, but hobbyist thinkers, so that everything can be reduced back to self-love or self-preservation. The point that I want to make, and why the self-esteem question is very, very important. It's a very complex question, something that a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about. But self-esteem comes through Mandeville's sort of a distinction that he makes of our love of the self-preservation is one side of it, but then there's the kind of love of praise that we have as human beings. So the whole idea that our psychological makeup is made out of the fact that we need approval of others. Sort of if we don't have, I mean, it doesn't have to be real. That's also important, but we need to have some kind of a reciprocity in the way that we think about ourselves, and we're often mistaken. There's a sort of Jansenist, sort of Augustinian background to thinking like this, but we are often mistaken of what is our actual worth. So we kind of, as human beings, we need to think well of ourselves in order to be able to cope with anything. And if we think from the perspective of being sort of producers to the market, so that we actually keep up producing things and being beneficial to others, we need to have a certain way of thinking about ourselves in a positive way, sort of a self-esteem perspective that can be prompted in many different types of ways. But for Mandeville, he's quite clear that our self-liking can trump our views of self-love. So Andrea Branchi, who has been working, he wrote one of the reply essays, but he's been working a lot on dueling, for example, and duel as a kind of a code of honor, and the way that how these kind of different social interactions and reference groups are formed is a good example when people, just because of their self-esteem or pride, whatever we want to call it, they can be ready to sacrifice their lives in order to keep the view of themselves through the eyes of others. So that you are kind of, that if you come to the point, if we're looking at from the sort of rational perspective, or the perspective of thinking about self-love, then of course all of our actions would be guided and directed towards self-preservation and life, keeping up comforts of life and so forth. But if you are ready to sacrifice that, be that in a duel because somebody has said that you're lying or whatever, and you're ready to sacrifice your life, it is kind of putting things in a sort of a different type of a perspective. But then if we look at it from the perspective of self-esteem, the whole culture of politeness that was in the 18th century is really built up on these ideas that if we think what is relevant for self-love, and oftentimes it means that we are able to accumulate different forms of wealth. The first principle that needs to be coined in a society is that if I own something, I need to be able to trust that others won't take it away from me if I just look the other way. Without that, you can't have civil society or large societies, because it always crumbles down. So from the perspective of self-love and self-preservation, we need to have a rule of law that secures the possessions that we have, and that is really important. But in the same way, what Mandeville is doing, he's arguing that we need to have a similar system, sort of or a way to live in a society where our often faulty ideas of our own worth aren't all the time sort of put down. And that creates this kind of a virtuous circle of self-esteem, where you have a culture where you say nice things to a person, even if you at times might not really feel them, and so forth. But this is a way of creating one side of the culture of politeness where sort of mutual respect is paid, and everybody can feel worthy about themselves. So, but then when it comes, okay, sorry, yeah. Go ahead.
I was gonna just pause a moment. This is, so basically what you're arguing is that the Hobbesian conception of just having property rights and rule of law is not sufficient for Mandeville, because what he wants is self-esteem, and that segues into an almost psychological effect where we pick up with Hayek, who has that spontaneous order piece, right? And so that ability to be able to create these self-organizing orders without a constructivist sort of a top-down model. And in your view, what's going on is that and in the view, I think, of most people who are serious scholars in this, that the sort of puritanical religious views at the time are acting as sort of a constructivist force to try to structure society in a way that's antithetical to the analytical views that Mandeville has. But he's not merely Hobbes. He's not merely Hobbes who says you need force in order to be able to solve these problems. You need more than that. And you need you need something like self-esteem. Is that a fair way to think about this?
That's very well put. Much better than me, Pat. So thanks. But yeah, and well, the whole it becomes the evolution, how the spontaneous order. That this is that you start developing. One of the points that I want to make is that you start, like Mandeville says, that people realize that if you're living in a sort of a, I mean, the division is exactly like a small clan-based society, and then a larger civil society where all the morals and so forth can, in Hume's terms, be called artificial. Mm-hmm. So there is no natural reason why I wouldn't be, taking things from you that I would like to have. There is no, I mean, but it's created. The morality is created in a way. When the evolution goes along, I can sort of take in the moral code, and that can replace what I naturally feel. So I would naturally be always partial towards the people around me, but once I've internalized the kind of way that civil society functions, I start respecting the way of doing that in a sort of a different way. But with respect to with sort of a rule of law and property rights, it is often, I mean, that's there at the core of a sort of a Hobbesian way of looking at it. But then, I mean, the one very, very important point that Mandeville is making is that we need a sort of similar way of building the question of how to give room to everybody's self-esteem. And that then becomes a fairly complicated issue for him. And there is the point that, I mean, there is the spontaneous order or spontaneous way of developing these can take you to a point, but then you need the political element when laws are actually coined. And this is very, very important. And also for, I mean, the rule of law, you can get to a point where you agree. First, some people have a sort of tacit agreement how things are done, how, for example, rural community functions in a village. That can be based on a sort of tacit agreement. But then when you want to make a larger civil society, you need to have a political element that coins these different customs and so forth. With respect to when it comes to actual property, this has been done often. But then, I mean, when we step out of the 18th century and look at the way that you can secure people's self-esteem and so forth, the picture comes much, much more complex and complicated. So when people turn back to 18th century, oftentimes this kind of a self-love element is there and recognized, but in order to have the full Mandevillian picture, you would also need to deal with the self-esteem question.
So this is really helpful, except that you've now stuck me at a fork in the road, because I can go in one of two directions based on your answer. I have two questions prepared for it. I think I'm going to stick with the order, and if I'm wrong, so be it. But because your answer really, first of all, raises the question of context, and this was something that I was struck by in your essay, because you, in comparing the way that Hayek and the way that Mandeville think about these things, you draw some awfully strong similarities. One of the things that I was struck by, I was kind of prompted to go back and reread selections from Constitution of Liberty, which you cite in your essay by Hayek. And one of the things that struck me is that Hayek is reacting to the rise of socialism, a much more widespread franchise. Democracy is much more widespread than it would have been during Mandeville's period and when he was living in England. And that context, it makes it, I guess I'd like to ask you kind of flat out, what are some of the contextual differences that might give us different conclusions that might help explain some of the differences between Hayek and Mandeville and the way they view these matters? Right.
I mean, well, of course, I mean, what I'm doing, what I also quite explicitly say in the essay is that when you're coming, I mean, if you look at what Mandeville is doing, he's of course doing it in the 18th century context.
Right.
So his way of dealing, I mean, and it's the question of how to deal with the poor that becomes really an issue here. So Mandeville's way of dealing with the poor is really sort of an easy way, or not necessarily easy, but within the 18th century reality. So the idea is that it is not a democratic world, that the 18th century. It is just basically saying that it is the poor are best off and with their self-esteem when they don't start comparing themselves with the middle class. So poor needs to be kept poor, and that's it. Basically for how Mandeville is looking at it. But it's, I mean, as a state physician, he's still trying to deal with the situation, you know. But then, I mean, that if we come out of 18th century, even to the world that Hayek is looking at, and so forth. And when he's talking about the spontaneous order and so forth, this is a very, very different type of a world where we are living with. The question of how to deal with the poor is very, very different than the 18th century. And so what I don't know. I mean, that the way that I've been always struck, I mean, about Hayek is that, of course, I mean, in Europe, oftentimes Hayek is developed something as who gives Margaret Thatcher a reason to say very bad things from anybody who works at the university and so forth. But Hayek is also he's a very, very kind of a sensitive intellectual and thinking about these issues. So I mean, the fact that he's not really raising, I mean, that then he's turning to a more, when he's talking about the spontaneous order, and he's not picking up the political element. That strikes me that in the perspective of how Mandeville is dealing with things. So for that, the fact that for Hayek, the spontaneous order just means that whatever the strongest or the most useful habits or customs, that's fine enough. But from in the Mandevillian perspective, that's not how it goes, because then you might be at the situation where a certain bunch of individuals are kind of sidetracking the whole development until then. So the political element there is very much nursing the type of spontaneous order that takes a particular path because of human nature. So in Mandeville's view, it is just not any type of conventions that start to spring out. It is for a reason related to particular passions in human nature, and those are the self-love and self-liking.
And and I think in a Hayekian perspective too, because Hayek likes to rely very much on evolutionary theory, right? I mean, Hayek says the reason we are developing these norms and practices because they are the most evolutionarily advantaged, and we only know this. One of the advantages of being able to do this is then you can say, well, we know which ones were evolutionary advantage because here we are, right? But Hayek points to these things, and Mandeville the same way. But again, I think not getting normatively involved with judging them, and also not trying to reconstruct them as both socialists in Hayek's time and religious leaders and those trying to impose certain moral values during Mandeville's time were trying to do. So in this sense, there's great similarity between the two thinkers as well. I wanted to move back to Mandeville before we forget about him, but I also wanted to do something else that you have to do with every Mandeville discussion, and that's compare him to Smith. And in your response to the first round of essays, you mention Smith, Mandeville, and Hume as individuals who you call skeptical sentimentalists, or who support something called skeptical sentimentalism. As I read your essay, and as I read the acknowledgement of things like self-esteem, and the acknowledgement of how simplicity and thinking about material goods is not sufficient for any of those three thinkers. Can you describe a little bit about? Well, maybe I should begin with asking you this: do you think Mandeville and Smith are that far apart in their positions?
Not at all.
So why do we characterize them that way? Why do they get characterized that way?
Well, I mean, so the reason that, I mean, the way that intellectual history or the 18th century scenario has been written, Hutcheson, Shaftesbury, they played a huge role in the way that people wanted to, phrase them. They are everything but skeptical in a way. I mean, that they are sort of a moralist in a very sort of traditional way. What is important and what has been picked up is that, of course, for both Shaftesbury and Hutcheson, the role, I mean, the way that they characterize human nature and civil society, it is placed on, the sentiment, which is also then very important for Hume and Smith. But the way that for a long time how intellectual history was written was that, I mean, Mandeville's put aside, and then it said that Smith and maybe also Hume, that they follow directly from Hutcheson, who was the sort of grand teacher of things. And I don't think, I mean, that okay, there are reasons why the shade of color in Smith is different from Mandeville and Hume. He's maybe a bit less skeptical than them as a moral thinker, but still, I think, I mean, that if we want to draw this kind of a school divisions, I think Mandeville, Hume, and Smith, they are very much there in the, you know, sort of similar school of thinking, and also skeptical in a way that they are not moralist in a way that Shaftesbury and Hutcheson are, and that I think is an important thing to acknowledge, and that helps quite a bit to then understanding the way that Smith is oftentimes looking at things. Of course, everybody always had to take distance from Mandeville. So for example, Hume, when he's almost at his most Mandevillian, he needs to say that The Fable of the Bees, of course, is a bad book and so forth. Yet he just takes and implements and of course elaborates on the thinking.
So you would, is the distinction, might it be fair to say the distinction is Hume, Smith, and Mandeville are doing something closer to a sort of moral sociology? They're trying to analyze, they're looking at society and trying to figure out how it works, whereas Hutcheson and Shaftesbury, and by the way, I should say Liberty Fund publishes all these authors, so I would encourage any viewer to go check out our webpage and look into these texts, and they're on the OLL as well. But that those individuals are doing more high theory, and I mean, it's not, my boss edited the Shaftesbury, so I got to be careful about what I say here, but that Shaftesbury is, for example, doing more high theory and not as engaged in the sort of sociology of it. Mandeville, of course, was a physician. He was treating the poor, right? He knew of the poor and he knew of their challenges and incorporated that into his thinking. Is that kind of a fair characterization?
Yeah, that's a very good characterization. And well, I guess the normativity of it all. I mean, that when you're writing, you know, if you're trying to, I mean, it doesn't mean that an author couldn't have also very normative perspectives and so forth, but they're approaching as the questions as more anatomically. I guess it could be also a word used. Of course, I mean Smith of course has more complexity to it because he's also writing against Hume in particular points, and for him the question of moral worth, actual worth, being moral and not just doing the things, you know, doing the right things for right reasons. I mean, he cares more about that genuinely, I think, than Mandeville and Hume as well.
I agree. Let's finish up with, I'm going to put two comparisons that you've got in your essays on the table, and I'm going to let you run with both of them and sort of discuss them and flesh them out a little bit for our viewers. The first one is the role of charity as compared to welfare in Mandeville. And the second one is self-esteem and politeness and how they contrast in Mandeville or how they fit together. And if you can help our readers work through those two comparisons, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, all right. So charity as a concept. So maybe I can relate all of these. So self-esteem and charity relate very well because, I mean, for Mandeville, being a sort of a object of charity is sort of degrading. So sort of when you are accepting alms and so forth, it turns you into kind of a sort of a beggarly like type of a character. And so from the Mandevillian view, that if we think about society, of course, welfare in general at the time was very, very different. That if there are sort of a certain kind of a way of putting together a society where there are sort of a general principles to apply to everyone, from the self-esteem perspective, welfare society, be that like this kind of maybe I'm looking at it from the Nordic perspective, where our Nordic welfare state is something that encompasses the whole society in some sense. Of course, we are talking about very small communities, so maybe in the US you may have such communities, but in a not on a national scale in a way. But I think for Mandeville he has article, he writes against charity schools, for example,
Yes.
where he very much goes against the idea that everyone should have sort of a similar type of schooling. And so for him, charity schools are just a way of bringing out individuals who are more crafty pickpockets and so forth. So that he goes very much against this type of way of thinking. But then if we look at it from the perspective of coming out of the 18th century towards today, where we want to live in a more democratic society, and in that situation, if you're dependent directly based on particular person doing charity towards you, from a self-esteem perspective, that's a difficult type of concept. But having some sort of a state-run system where the welfare is done in a way that it isn't you personally accepting the alms or having sort of a system of state funded housing and support in that sense, that can give you a basis for self-esteem in a very different type of way, and forming the kind of a sort of a basis for social peace in a very different way. What comes to, what was the other one? Politeness and
the other one was well, it would be, yeah, self-esteem and politeness. So politeness in general, and I think that you could either compare it to politeness and self-esteem, or politeness and welfare and charity.
Yeah. So again, the politeness that Mandeville is talking about, so it's a very complicated, ritualized way of exchanging respect and so forth, which then underneath it, the reason why it's done is that you're able to uphold your self-liking, like I was talking at the very beginning. And so the way, I mean, that it's important, the question that why do we have different kinds of social institutions? And the idea of politeness is directly so that it can uphold our self-esteem in a way, in a particular way. So if we would be in a kind of state of war with respect to who gets respect, of course we are competing for it, but there needs to be some kind of a, I guess it's called civility, in the way that we behave towards each other, so that we can, if we would every time we would need to be fighting for any kind of recognition, just living in general would be pretty intolerable in a way. So I guess, I mean, for Mandeville, of course, in the 18th century, this meant the system was very, very complicated, how to exchange these politenesses in a proper type of way. But for example, Hume, when he went to Paris, the porters, they were considered the most unruly people, and Hume's observation was that in Paris, he was very taken by Paris and politeness, the French type of politeness, Hume. So for Hume, he was very taken by the fact that porters are even civil towards each other. So the idea that it's always easy to be polite towards people who are kind of above you in the rank or so forth, but it's really the question that how are you towards the people who are sort of at the similar level in terms of ranking, or you know, it was a very hierarchical society then. But from our perspective, I mean, I suppose that in order to live a tolerable life, you need some kind of a way of feeling good about yourself, and whether that comes out of manners or whether there are other ways of building it, but it's still, I mean, the Mandevillian idea is that the foundation for everything is that you, how you feel as a person about yourself. Of course, I mean, the way that we construct that there are of course, the local variance, as I say, is very, very different. So manners in one country or in one era are very, very different. But it's often forgotten that also from political perspective, the way that we sort of treat each other, it matters. So very trivial in a way, but
no, I don't think so at all. I think it's very important, and I think, well, the breadth of this conversation has shown the breadth of the thought of Bernard Mandeville, and so I would strongly encourage all of our viewers to explore some of these issues, pick up a copy of the text that Liberty Fund publishes, or reach out to the internet and find other sources of Mandeville that are publicly available. There's a lot of richness in the forum, and I would encourage everyone to go back and read the essays if you've not done so already, or take another look at them, because we've raised a number of issues, and we could go on for another hour, and it wouldn't be, or another half hour, I should say, and it wouldn't, we still wouldn't go through all of it. Mikko, I want to thank you very much for participating in the author interviews for Liberty Matters.
Thank you, Pat.